stories about the toll it's taken on our littles, our children, as well as our parents, our educators, our administrators. A household it did not greatly impact, however, was mine. So this is how it started. In early 2013, and when I say early, this was probably about March, April, I walked up to my husband in the house. He was walking out of our bedroom, I was walking out of our kitchen. This was not planned at all, and I just looked at him and sporadically said, I think I should homeschool the boys. We have two sons, so at the time we have Jeremiah, who it was on the left. Jeremiah was heading into second grade at this point. And then we had our youngest, they're 13 months apart, Jericho, who was heading into first grade. And I walked up and I said, I think I should homeschool the boys. And my husband asked me the hardest question ever. He said, why? One word, why? And I just stood there. And at the time, I really didn't have the words to express why. It was just a feeling I had. It was in my spirit. This was something I needed to do with my boys, right? I didn't necessarily that day, when he asked me why, I didn't talk to him about how since I'd had them and birthed them, that the school to prison pipeline was a fear for me. Or them being mistreated in school when they were away from me at home, that was a fear for me, right? I didn't talk to him about all these fears I actually had with them going into the classroom. And this comes from someone who's loved school my whole life. They have not been able, my parents have not been able to keep me out of school since the first day they put me in kindergarten. I promise you, I find a way to come back every time. I love school. I've always been ingrained in school. I went to public school. My husband went to private school. But when it was time for my boys, there was just something in me that this feeling. I needed them to be at home. I needed them to be with me. And so we had this conversation, and my husband kind of blew it off and was just like, no, they need to go to school. We both went to public school. We're fine, blah, blah, blah. You teach. Everything's great. Fast forward 6 months. Have the boys enrolled. They're getting ready to start school. I'm the PTA president. If I can't keep them at home, guess what? I'm going to be there every chance I get. I'm the homeroom mom for both of their classes. I am all about PT. I am all there. 6 months later, my husband walks up to me. He said, you know what? I was thinking and praying, I think we should homeschool the boys. Like I had never said this, y'all. Like I never brought this to him. This was his, and sometimes I figure that out. It has to be their idea. I was like, that sounds like a good idea. I think we should homeschool the kids. But the boys were already enrolled. I was already dedicated to being the PTA president, so we went through that year. And our plan was, when they started third and second grade, we were going to start homeschooling. And so that's exactly what we did. We went through that year. I feel like I kind of cheated. They learned reading and things with the school. So that was all, all that was out the way by the time I got them, right? I did all the research, did all the planning. So the picture on the left is the first day of homeschooling. As you can see, Jeremiah is not looking very happy because he is his mother's child. He is very emotional. Y'all pray for him. And the library did not have the book he wanted. So life was not happy. He was not happy that day, right? In Jericho, life is always a party. And then the picture that to the right was our next door neighbor who was also in second grade, Erin. She homeschooled with us the first year. In community. And so her and Jericho were both second grade, Jeremiah was third grade. This particular day, I'd taken them to the museum. We were talking about Egypt, and they got dead kids, and they were super excited. And so this is what started my journey of homeschooling. And over the years, what I found out is that why, that question that my husband asked me that day, why? What has evolved in that one question over the years for me? So today what I want to talk to you all about, I want to provide a brief introduction into homeschooling in its historical context, and that will be very brief. I want us to explore how African American homeschooling continues to be rooted in a legacy of resiliency. That's very important in that understanding, especially considering that that is a growing demographic. The amount of African American families that have opted to homeschool their children. I want to define and discuss self-taughtness and home place, two important terms, and then I want to examine some of the motivations for African American homeschooling. So first thing I want to talk about is the definition of homeschooling, because as homeschooling evolves, so does the evolution of what is considered homeschooling. Now, generally, the term homeschooling is always tied to educating one's child at home, and different people will see that in different ways. Greenwald talks about how oftentimes that the term homeschooling is believed as this parent to teacher, where it's like the parent is just a teacher, very much similar to what you would see in school. Parents, we bring out books and papers and pens, and it's just like we put on our teacher cap and that's what we do. That's what most people believe homeschooling is, and that's all it is. It's just very similar to school, structured just like school, and we teach. And so it gives this impression that, again, children can only learn when there's this hierarchical relationship, right? That I always have to be in the forefront, being the one who's facilitating the learning. And as I've learned over the last years that I've had my boys, that is not the case. I learn just as much, and I learn as much from them as I think sometimes as I'm given also. But I like this last definition. Greenwald himself wrote this book, and it's called Homeschooling, and he uses the slash. And he talks about how it's time for us to rethink what homeschooling is, what it can be. And he talks about rethinking it as a relationship between home and school, parents and teachers, and even men and women. Because oftentimes when you hear the term homeschooling, who do we typically think about as far as being teachers at home? Mom, which is typically it, but dads play a part in homeschooling as well. Even if they are not there facilitating the learning, there's typically a role that they play as well. And I think that last concept is very important, because even when my boys were going to school, when they came home and they had a stack of worksheets this high that they had to do for homework, who was helping them with that? I was, my husband was. And so homeschooling is something from morals to values to learning to wash your clothes, self-care. We are always homeschooling. We're always homeschooling. So, homeschooling, who and why? Who homeschools and why do individuals homeschool? Homeschooling is widely practiced. So in January 2020, I want to give you some numbers now. I'm not a quantitative person. I am definitely qual. But there are some numbers here that I think are important. In January 2020, right before COVID hit, there were an estimated 2 million children that were homeschooled in this country. So 2 million in early January 2020. By the fall of 2020, that number had rose to 3.7 million children that were homeschooled. Black students now account for close to 10% of homeschooled children. We have it's estimated over 300,000 Black families now homeschool their children. According to the Census Bureau, 3.3% of Black families homeschooled in the spring of 2020. By that fall, that 3.3 had raised to 16% of Black families that homeschooled. And despite these numbers, homeschooling is still so homogenized. The beliefs of who does it, what it is, what it can be, and why people do it are typically from research and policy homogenized. As scholarship has explored, homeschooling is often associated with white, two-parent, conservative Christian, middle-class families with at least one parent with a substantial income source. Even in Black families, it's believed that when Black families homeschool, the majority of the time, it has something to do with spirituality, that is rooted in religion. This even here for Oklahoma. If you don't know this, Oklahoma has the largest number of homeschooling families because our state has no laws for homeschooling. We have the most open homeschool. We have no regulation for it. So anyone in this state can opt to homeschool their children. You don't have to report to the state. You just say, I'm going to keep my kids at home, and that's it. So we have the largest homeschooling base here in the nation, in this state. Families have used home education always. It's a staple of this nation. The earliest schools were home schools. Indigenous nations were the first to use homes as a place of learning. Settlers used homes for the first 40 years of the colony's existence, so there's never been a time where homeschool was not practiced here in America. And there are numerous motivations for homeschooling. They're driven by, for the indigenous, historically, they were driven by the knowledge of the land, which was survival. This means how do you go out and hunt, fish, gather, how do you survive, and tribal traditions. Early settlers and European Americans, this was largely driven by faith, but it was also driven by the dissatisfaction of public schooling. For African American families, homeschooling, the motivations have deeply been rooted in resistance and a legacy of resilience. So let's talk about this legacy of resiliency in African American families. African American homeschool continues a legacy that has been embraced by African Americans since slavery. Communal self-agency and self-determination have been salient to our quest for education always. Educational freedom and excellence have been viewed as liberatory, and historically, when education has been restricted or denied, we've always had that attitude of by any means necessary, that we were going to learn and we were going to teach our children as well. And so again, in resisting oppression and overcoming the challenges, and we're going to talk about some of those challenges. Dr. Butler Barnes already talked about some of those challenges earlier today. This legacy has been built amongst our community, and it's deeply rooted in two concepts: self-taughtness and home place. And I want to talk about both of those. So self-taughtness is this notion of it's rooted in our ancestral history, African Americans' ancestral history of the communal efforts and agencies to share knowledge. And self-taughtness could be seen in everything from in slavery pit schools, where slaves would go out and dig huge spaces, huge holes that were called pits, and they would cover them up so that they wouldn't be seen. And at nighttime, they would go to these pits, and any slaves who knew how to read or write or who had education shared in this space with other slaves. So that's one of the, again, this is a legacy of ours. During segregated schooling, Black communities educated their children. We educated our children. We used one another. We used the church. We leaned to the church. The interconnection between homes and schools. We sent some kids to other families. If I had to work, I could send my kids over to a neighbor's house for schooling. This is what went on during segregated schooling. The home has always been an integral site for learning. And Bell Hooks talked about the significance of this with her term, home place. This concept was introduced by her, and it refers to how Black women have played a key role in the family and making the home a place where we can strive and learn and grow. The focus is on the important and critical role of Black women in the home and the community. In her essay, Home Place, A Site of Resistance, Bell Hooks states that, quote, Black women resisted by making homes where all Black people could strive to be subjects, not objects, where we could be affirmed in our minds and hearts despite poverty, hardship, and deprivation, where we could restore to ourselves dignity denied to us on the outside of the public world. So again, creating that space in the home for survival, for thriving, for learning, and education is central to that. So homeschooling allows Black families today, right now, at this time, to create spaces where our children can be educated, thrive, and it reprioritizes and reclaims home place, something that has been very important to us historically. So some of the motivations for why African Americans have started to homeschool. Believe it or not, it was around 2013, 2014, this topic actually blew up in scholarship. Lots of scholars started to do research on why have so many African American families, why are so many Black families opting to homeschool their children? And so from that time, in looking at the motivations, these four are themes that have come forth. The first four bullets are themes that have come forth from research that has been pulled from 1996 through 2015. So earliest research started as early as 1996, but it really expanded and it's going further at this point. So 4 major themes came out of this. Discipline disproportionately is one reason. Children labeled troublemakers, constant negative communications from schools about kids. Dr. Butler Barnes hit it on the head earlier with her presentation. Throughout the 20th century, we've seen plenty of scholarship on how Black boys are treated in schools. The marginalization, the oppression, the criminalization of our young Black males. Well, now we have a substantial body of scholarship coming out on increasingly how that criminalization has now turned towards our girls. The contributions of scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw, Monique Morris, Ruth Nicole Brown, all make it clear that African American girls are routinely disbarred from ideas of childhood, they're disbarred from ideas of girlhood and equitable education. As noted by the Black Girls Matter pushed out over-policed and underprotected report, schools across the country are using punitive disciplinary measures against Black girls routinely at unprecedented rates. So, definitely discipline, one. Lack of social, cultural connection and curriculum and teaching style is another. And that also was touched upon in the earlier talk. This lack of cultural and historical representation, monocultural approach to teaching and learning, restriction of movement. I actually heard a talk that talked about how when we look at the books that we have in our K through our elementary schools, when it comes to indigenous individuals, school books have not been changed since they were pretty much presented. So you talk about cultural representation, right? And what does that mean? When my boys were in school, they both were the only child of color in their class each year. My oldest, most days when I walked in, he was sitting off by himself, segregated, every day when I walked in, reading a book. And I asked his teacher one day, I said, what is going on? Is he being disciplined? And she said, no, Mom, he's done. He's finished all his work. And I'm like, okay, give him more. Because that's what a mom says, all right? Give him more. Find something else for him to do. And she said, well, I'm giving him 4th grade math and this and this and this and this. But ultimately, I'm thinking, okay, so now my kid has come here and he's done his work, he's done well, and so his reward for that is to be placed off somewhere alone by himself reading. And that just did not sit well with me. It didn't sit well with me at all. And it wasn't punishment per se, but then she was very forthright with me one day because we had a really good relationship, and she said, Mom, I want to explain something to you. And she said, school is for the kids in the middle. This is who we're here to teach to, the kids in the middle, not the kids up here. She said, your kid is one of the kids that's in the front. He's smart, he's self-determined, he can do things on his own. I'm not here to help him. And this is what broke my heart. She said, and I'm not here to help the ones that are in the back, who are struggling, who are behind. I don't have the time. The majority are in the middle. Right there is when I knew, I was like, this is not for me. This is not for my children. I don't see my children as falling. They're my kids, right? And so again, lack of social connection and curriculum, teaching style, low expectations, overpopulations of special education, the research goes on and on and on. And the research, there's a huge disconnect in the research. Black males especially disproportionately placed in special education. And it stops at K through 12, and I'm so interested in that. And you go into higher ed and you don't even see what the impact, there isn't a lot of research that tells us what the impact of that is, right? But overpopulating special ed and then being denied the gifted education. Negative self-esteem, negative identity, acceptance, being willing to accept, being mediocre, limited focus on critical thinking. These are all low expectations. And Black parents said, no more, we don't want this for our kids. School safety and climate. What's the 4th theme? Perceived or experienced violence. We see it on the news, how we have policemen literally going into classes slamming our kids on desks on floors. School low achieving, the school being low achieving, the testing, bullying, there's so much. And now this is compounded, this bullet, school safety and climate, with COVID. The first year COVID was out, what did we hear? It is impacting the Black community at a much higher rate. So that was another concern for Black parents at that point with schools. And all this can be summed up into one bullet, spirit, what's called spirit murdering. Spirit murdering is the way teachers use disciplinary practices, racism, prejudice, marginalization, negative attitudes towards special needs or special education or Black children in general. And this occurs daily in classrooms. It can be pedagogical, it can be institutional, or it can be individual. And so ultimately what happens is you have a child there, you have a body in that seat, but with no spirit because their spirit is broken, because they've had to go through any of the four or all of the four that have been present before. So these have been the motivations of many of the parents, that 300,000 plus who've opted to take their kids and have them at home. That's an act of resiliency. At some point, being willing to step forward and say, I am going to take the onus for, I'm going to take that on. Sometimes that does mean only one parent works. Sometimes that does mean, like in our household, how we did for the longest time, I would have the boys during the day, and when my husband came home, I called it like WWE tag team. We tagged off, we slapped hands on our ways out the door. Hey, we slapped off. I went to teach. I'm a community college professor. I would teach at night. I would have them and I would teach them during the day, and then he would come home and he would teach his portion or talk about the day or whatever they would do. So resiliency, it allows Black parents to enact counter practices that otherwise would harm their children, break their spirits. For many Black families, homeschooling is an act of resistance and protest. In exploring single Black mothers' resistance through homeschooling, Dr. Field Smith offers a new consideration for a motivation. She talks about healing, how homeschooling allows for healing from a lot of those earlier motivations that we saw. So we talked about, I told you all how it started. This is how it's going. So Jeremiah is now 15. He is a sophomore. Jericho is 14 and he is a freshman. They are both honor students. They are in honor society. They are both concurrently enrolled. Jeremiah is in a program right now where he is concurrently working on getting his associate's degree while in high school through Oklahoma Christian University. Jericho takes classes at Oral Roberts. And I want to highlight this about Jericho because this is very important to me. When you talk about special education, my baby has multiple learning disabilities along with ADHD. And he is striving and thriving and doing great things. And that's because I had the patience and the time to make education what it needed to be for him, right? And work with him where he was. And we can't always expect, and I value our educators. I never speak down on educators because I know how hard that is. But that was important to me with him, especially. Him having that space to learn and grow the way he needed to be able to learn and grow. And it's paid off. They're active in the community. I can't keep them at the house. I'm trying to push Jeremiah to get his license because I'm tired of driving, y'all. I commute to Stillwater from Oklahoma City. I need him to learn how to drive and quick. They're happy. They're thriving. They're resilient. Homeschooling, legacy, resilience. Thank you for listening and attending today.